our job is to make sure that we have solutions for customers along that journey. So when a customer comes to us and talking about SaaS, we need to understand what they're doing, and we want to make sure that we can provide solutions that kind of move along that journey with them as a provider on a journey to SaaS. And so our customers, and our job is to walk with them on that journey and make sure that we deliver the solutions that they really need at every step of that journey.
What is the actual value question? What is the big benefit when you talk about SaaS?
As I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits is you are offloading a lot of your IT cost and your IT burden to a service provider, essentially.
Today we'll talk about the topic of software as a service, so SaaS, and how it has been and how it is reshaping engineering simulation. Today I have Davison, Director Simcenter SaaS Product Management at Siemens Digital Industry Software in the show, and we'll talk a little bit about the value question, the cost question, and some other maybe important bits that engineers might be interested in listening to this podcast when it comes to SaaS. But maybe to start with maybe the basics, like what is SaaS to begin with? I know it's a very maybe redundant question, but maybe some engineers are not really well aware of what SaaS is in the first place. And why have we engineers decided to move to SaaS to begin with? What was the motivation?
That's a good question. So, I mean, strictly speaking, SaaS is software as a service, as you said, right? So, I guess traditionally, if you were looking to buy some engineering software, you'd come along to a provider such as Siemens Digital Industry Software. You'd buy some software, would send you a license, you install it on your machines, and off you go. But the reality is that software as a service is kind of something that is transforming software in general. It's not just engineering simulation. It's where essentially we are running some or all of your services or all your software on our cloud, essentially. So we are taking the burden of running the software away, and we're going to take that on. So obviously, if you look at big enterprise deployments, you've got large IT teams that are taking engineering software, other software, deploying it on their servers, operating those, dealing with security, cooling in the data centers, all of that kind of thing. But where you're talking about SaaS is you're kind of moving that more of that burden to the provider. And the reality is that each and every day we use SaaS, right? So this service we're using right now to record this podcast, that's a SaaS service, right? You're not installing anything locally on your machine. It's running through my browser. So someone is operating that for you. So really it's about taking the things you would normally install locally, but running them remotely and allowing someone else or letting someone else manage that for you, deal with all the intricacies of doing that. And there's a big benefit to that. Ultimately, it means that you're reducing kind of your overhead on the IT side of things, but you're also in an environment that's able to be more agile, to change more quickly. You're able to adopt new technologies more easily because you don't have to wait for it to be all installed, verified, and so on and so forth. I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, it pretty much covers it. The question always is, I mean, maybe people get adopt more and more the kind of idea of SaaS because maybe they use the G Suite, maybe they use simulation tools that are hosted on the cloud. The question is like, what is the actual value? Because when I first heard about SaaS and was working for a company that was doing a SaaS or building a SaaS product, and was always about the rigidity aspect versus the elasticity aspect, right? Where you could be elastic and theoretically you could spin up an infinite amount of cores if you want to, right, or GPUs in order to run your simulation. Like, what is the actual value question? What is the big benefit when you talk about SaaS versus if you have a rigid setup in maybe your office or so?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the reality is the value is different for different people and different use cases. Ultimately, when it comes to engineering simulation, one of the big benefits is the elasticity you mentioned, right? So you have the ability to access high performance computing pretty much on demand. You're going to hyperscalers who have huge computational resources available to them, not just in one data centers, but lots of data centers around the world. So you get that kind of agility, that ability to burst. As I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits is you are offloading a lot of your IT cost and your IT burden to a service provider, essentially, who deal with everything from the security, the management of the software, updates of the software. The other one is ultimately, if I look at the HPC world and certainly within engineering simulation, if you're looking to buy large clusters, thousands and thousands of cores, that's a significant capital expenditure. So you've got to go out and you've got to physically buy that. You've got to put it in a data center somewhere. You've got to pay for that data center. You've got to pay for the power. You've got to pay for the cooling. There's overhead to that as well. And then the reality is if you're making that significant capital investment, you've got to justify that investment over a long period of time. And so if I go out and buy a data center today, if I go and buy my laptop today, the reality is in a few months, it's kind of a little bit out of date because hardware technology is moving so quickly that anything you buy today is going to be, out of date to some degree at a certain point in the future. Again, one of the benefits of the SaaS is that the hyperscalers are constantly investing in new hardware. They're constantly installing the latest hardware. And so that means that you can benefit from advances in hardware technology almost as soon as they're available. So, just look at GPUs. GPUs become available. They get installed in the hyperscaler data centers. You can adopt them straight away. So does that benefit as well? You're not kind of stuck with a fixed capacity that is, potentially 2-3 years old hardware. You'll actually be able to kind of move as time goes by. And the other, the benefit I see, again, kind of somewhat specific to engineering simulation is if your company's investing in, potentially millions and millions of dollars to build a big data center, they have to look at all of the different things that data center is going to be used for. Maybe it's used for CFD, maybe it's used for structural analysis, crash, and so on and so forth. Now, each of those different analysis types have kind of got different requirements on the hardware. So you run into the possibility that you actually start to make compromises as to the configuration of your cluster. You want something that kind of does everything. So that means it's not going to be optimal for any one thing. Again, the benefit of moving to SaaS and leveraging cloud-based resources is that you can basically pick and choose the exact hardware that is most optimal for your simulation type. And that's, I think, something that's kind of maybe not discussed quite so much is the fact that, you don't have to necessarily compromise. You can pick whatever is best fit for, if you're a CFD engineer, the hardware that is best for CFD engineer. If you're structural analysis, the hardware that is best for structural analysis. You don't have to kind of make a compromise. Okay, well, I've got to buy something or use something that kind of has to do everything.
Yeah. Do you think then, Joel, the question of cost is kind of redundant because, on-premise is always more expensive than the SaaS solution? Is that always the case, or is there more to the story?
The question of cost is never truly redundant. Ultimately, a company's got to balance the benefits of moving to the SaaS to the cost of moving to SaaS. I think one of the challenges we see when we have conversations around SaaS is there's a tendency to look at SaaS just from the how much does the software cost, how much does the hardware cost? Okay, let's compare this to a SaaS solution. But the reality is, and one of the things we always talk a lot about is, what's the total cost of ownership? And that means not just how much does the software and the hardware cost, how much does it cost you to operate that if you have it on premise? And that means, the IT teams and the specializations they require to operate it, the power required to run your data center, the cooling implications. So there's a lot more to just the software and the hardware, and it can just look like that. So if you just compare software to hardware, yes, SaaS probably doesn't look that attractive. But the reality is you've got to look at it in the round, and that's really where it becomes more attractive. And the reality is it is getting cheaper and cheaper. Like any new technology, the bigger it gets, the more it gets adopted, the more it becomes available. So yeah, I think ultimately, you do have to look at that, and there's always a balance. And what we do see with our customers is they're on a journey, right? They're not, just everybody jumping on SaaS straight away. They're on a journey from where they are in an on-prem world to a SaaS world. And it's really a spectrum along that. And we see some customers who are very much at that kind of extreme end of, heavily adopting cloud technologies and SaaS technologies, some that are maybe a little more immature, I guess, in that journey. And then there's a lot of people in different stages along the way. And that I think is a reflection of understanding that value of SaaS, seeing how it applies to CAE. And I think the reality is that in the CAE industry, I won't say we're behind necessarily, but if you look at where SaaS is elsewhere, it's kind of ubiquitous, right? You don't install anything really nowadays. All of it's running on the cloud in some way, shape, or form. And I think that adoption is just starting to really ramp up in the CAE space, and we're seeing that in what we're doing as well. And as I said, that means that there is this kind of spectrum of where people are on their journey to SaaS.
Yeah, when we look at the Joel and the innovation adoption lifecycle, right? We have the late majority towards the end of the spectrum, and then the laggards. The question is, will it become less, or do you think the it's more like a trend people want to jump on because everybody's doing SaaS, so I also have to do SaaS. So what do you think is the main motivation, especially for big businesses or maybe small and medium-sized enterprises to jump on the topic of SaaS, especially for simulation purposes?
Well, so for small and medium size, I think that's where we see probably more adoption ultimately, because a small and medium sized business probably don't have the budgets to invest heavily in on-prem data centers, on-prem clusters. That again, the value of that will pay out over a number of years. So I think that's where we see actually more adoption, because it gives small and medium businesses the ability to get to much greater scale earlier. And they can access the scale of HPC resources that a hyperscaler has and that we provide much more easily. And they would never get the ability really to get to that scale if they were having to invest millions and millions of dollars on-prem. But simply, they don't have the ability to make that kind of capital investment. So I think in the small and medium business space, that's really where we see a lot of traction. Enterprises is slightly different, as you kind of can imagine. Enterprises can often move at a somewhat different pace to small and medium businesses, and so they have, obviously, a lot of them will still have legacy data centers, and they're continuing to justify that investment. And then also, if you get into certain industries, there's much greater constraints over what they can do with SaaS. So the defense industry is a perfect example. They often obviously have extremely tight controls over their security, over their data tenancy, and so on. And so that means that they are constrained. And so the hyperscalers are reacting to that with specific resources for the defense industry. AWS GovCloud is kind of the typical example there. So there's lots of different reasons why a company may or may not be able to move to SaaS. It's not just about the ability, not just about necessarily justifying the cost or that kind of move. There's lots of different reasons. Ultimately, as I said, I think small and medium businesses, we see a lot of the adoption of our Simcenter HPC solution, because that's where, they don't have the resources on-prem, so they don't, they're not trying to justify that investment, and they have they can see the benefit of, okay, I can suddenly get more HPC, which means I can do more in simulation, I can do more sophisticated simulations, I can do the simulations I do today faster and get more of them done.
You talked about security, Joel. So maybe the question from the audience is, maybe, is my data actually secure on the cloud? I mean, right now it's ubiquitous, as you said. Like if we use the G Suite, for example, everything is on the cloud, so we kind of use it on a day-to-day basis. But now we've also had the case that Cloudflare was down for a couple of times right in the last couple of weeks. So the question always is, like, am I outsourcing my security to some third party which I have no control over? So is the cloud secure?
That's a very good question. I would maybe flip it around and say, is your on-prem architecture secure? There's nothing to necessarily guarantee that just because you're on the cloud, you're not, you're more of a target. Ultimately, your on-prem is a target as well. And we see that with, many kind of widely publicized hacks with, ransomware and so on and so forth. So it's not just a case of, is the cloud more or less secure? Ultimately, security is a concern no matter where you are. The one thing you obviously have in the cloud is you have scale, you have hyperscalers whose job zero is essentially doing security. So the hyperscalers, they wouldn't be in business if their services weren't secure. Pretty much everything these days runs on one of those hyperscalers, AWS, Azure, and so on and so forth. So security is like the first thing they talk about. And as a provider of SaaS, that is true of us as well, right? We know that our business will fail if we aren't secure. If we have a service that is vulnerable to outside interference, then that's going to be a huge problem. As a result, ultimately what we do is we follow the industry standard certifications, ISO 27K, SOC 2 compliance, and so on and so forth. And that gives us that kind of credibility when it comes to security. And I'm not going to say that a customer will just take that and say, absolutely fine, yeah, they will look at that. But they'll also ask us questions. And when we go to customers, they ask us those questions. They ask us to help them understand what our architecture looks like, assure them that they're secure. And that's just natural, I think. But I think it's not just as simple as saying, oh, well, if it's on the cloud, maybe it's not secure as on-prem. ultimately security is a concern for everybody, and the hyperscalers and ourselves, we wouldn't be in business if we weren't running a secure service.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the adoption journey, right? So if someone asks themselves the questions, how should I start a journey for SaaS? I mean, there's different models out there, like software as a service, platform as a service, and maybe even infrastructure as a service. Now, the question also is, you talked about it earlier, Joel, is the total cost of ownership, right? The capital expenditure, the operational expenditure, etc. So there's so many parameters for a business. What should they think about when they want to start the SaaS journey? Like, I mean, maybe you can talk about it from the Siemens point of view, how you would help a business actually adopt SaaS.
Well, I think the first question is what do they need? What are they looking to do with their software today? So, 99% of the time, what we're doing is we're talking to a customer who has an existing solution, an existing on-prem solution. And we need to understand what they see the benefits of SaaS for their business are. We're obviously there to also help them understand what we see the benefits are, and then understand what that deployment looks like. I mean, one of the things that become clear is ultimately, as I said, there's this kind of spectrum of SaaS, as it were, where customers are different ways along that journey. And so what we're doing and what we're ensuring we're doing is providing solutions that kind of go along all that spectrum. So just a few weeks ago, we announced the release of what we call Simcenter Advanced. Now, Simcenter Advanced is essentially a solution that allows you to run as Simcenter tools on your local hardware resources, but connected to Siemens cloud-based services. So for entitlement, for software delivery, integrated data management, and an AI chatbot. And so, that's really maybe at this end of the spectrum, I guess. Like that's where, okay, I want to run locally, but I want to start to benefit from some of those services in the cloud. And then as we kind of move along that spectrum, we have solutions like Simcenter X HPC and Remote Desktop. There, what you're saying is, okay, well, maybe I'm still doing some of my setup on the cloud, but what I really want is access to that big HPC resource that a hyperscaler has. And so we provide that. We provide the customers the ability to kind of come along to us, say, okay, I just want to buy software and HPC all in one so I can really benefit from that scale. And so that journey, what's our job is to make sure that we have solutions for customers along that journey. So when a customer comes to us and starts talking about SaaS, we need to understand what they're doing, and we want to make sure that we can provide solutions that kind of move along that journey with them. So I always say that we as a provider are on a journey to SaaS, and so are our customers, and our job is to walk with them on that journey and make sure that we deliver the solutions that they really need at every step of that journey. But of course, we also need to make sure that we're working with them to understand, help them understand, what we see as the benefit to SaaS. And there's a benefit beyond just the simulation space. There's the tie into the wider digital thread, and how we deliver software as a service across the portfolio, not just for simulation, but for CAD, for PLM, and so on, so that we can move everything to the cloud for them.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the history or the evolution of HPC, because you're the expert. I think, Joel, you can talk a little bit about that. So obviously hardware scale exploded and the complexity moved more from only computation to more like an orchestration, if you want to call it like that. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the evolution of HPC happening? Like if you think back 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago versus the next 5 years, how do you think HPC or like the orchestration bit will evolve? And what does it mean for the engineering businesses in the future?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I did my PhD 20-something years ago in CFD, and I remember the time I got some budget to buy myself a computer, essentially, to run my CFD on, and I found someone that could give me 4 whole cores in my computer, and each of them were separate chips because they weren't multi-core chips, and I had to explain at length to the university IT team why I want a machine with more than one processor in it. So, and then I joined CD Adapco as a fresh-faced young support engineer 20 years ago. I think our biggest cluster was something like 64 cores. And so the reality is, I think the availability of HPC, the price of HPC has dropped so much that it's just, it's just that barrier to entry has dropped. And I think the other part of it is also we've had to evolve as a business to support that. So we launched what we called the Power Session, which was for Simcenter SaaS CCM Plus, which basically meant that you could run an unlimited course for a fixed cost. And what that was really a reflection of that availability of HPC, the lowering cost of HPC, that we started to see, well, if we're charging customers per core, then it's starting to become that the software is the barrier to entry, not the hardware. So we kind of shifted to make sure that our customers can access all the hardware that they wanted without having to worry about, is the software cost prohibitive? So I think that growth in HPC, that availability and that cost of HPC has been a critical one. Now, obviously, what we see is the emergence of GPUs. GPUs resources have the ability to really change how engineering simulation is done. They are obviously extremely fast, but they're also extremely power efficient. And so that's a big change. Now, the challenge with GPUs is obviously getting access to them. They're being used heavily in AI, and that means that getting access isn't necessarily so easy. The other thing we see is the emergence of lower power chips, ARM essentially. And again, lower power means lower overall cost. It also means that you can look at the kind of sustainability side of things, because you're losing less power to run your simulations for that. So they are the ARM CPUs. They offer a really great price performance trade-off. And so again, moving to that kind of lower power architecture's a big change as well, because that makes it more efficient, more cheaper, and of course more available.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, maybe before we wrap up the podcast, Joel, do we have something like a checklist, like a SaaS maturity checklist, if you want to call it like that, for people to see if their business is ready to adopt SaaS, or maybe if they're already using SaaS, what is it actually worth moving to, for example, for simulation purposes, moving to Simcenter?
That's a good question. I'm always going to answer the question: is it worth moving to Simcenter with yes? But I guess that's my job. But I think, whether there's a checklist or not, that's a good question. I mean, ultimately, every business is different, and their needs when it comes to SaaS is different. And the reality is that different companies are going to look at it differently. Right? So I mentioned Simcenter X HPC and remote desktop earlier. That's a real, that's kind of a really a turnkey solution. And we wanted to make it as easy as possible for a customer to come along and say, look, I want to do SaaS. I'm going to buy some what we call credits, which is a consumable model off you. I'm just going to want to get to HPC as quickly and easy as possible. I have no particular requirements about, but that's not necessarily for the case for all customers. A lot of customers will have big existing agreements with the hyperscalers. So they want to leverage the resources that they have as well to use that. So they will have these big commitments, and as a result, they want to say, okay, well, if I've made a commitment to spend, I want to make sure that whatever SaaS solution I'm using is going to burn down that commitment. And so they'll come along and say, look, your service is running on AWS. How can you support this? And that's one of the exciting things actually about the Altair acquisition, is they're bringing the tools and technologies that allow us to offer that as well. So Altair One being a perfect example, that allows customers to run Simcenter and Altair tools on whichever hyperscaler they want. So it's essentially a bring your own cloud model. So that kind of deals with the HPC. But the other one is, as I said earlier, there's how do we support customers who aren't necessarily moving significant amounts of HPC workload onto the cloud, working in more of a hybrid mode. So Simcenter X Advanced, I mentioned earlier, gives that ability to run locally. And so if a customer's got a large cluster available to them, they want to continue to use their workloads on-prem, they can leverage Simcenter X Advanced with those kind of connected services to do that on-prem. And they can mix it with other things like credits if they want to go into burst. So again, it's about that spectrum of SaaS, right? It's about that journey that our customers are going on, depending on what they need, what their infrastructure and their needs look like today, and also where they look going forward. So ultimately, customers, just like ourselves, are looking forward for the next 6 months, a year, to understand what are my needs going to be then, and then start that journey ahead of time and work with us. So, as I said, it's really about understanding what a customer needs, making sure we have the solutions available to fit those needs, but also to walk with them on their journey to SaaS, and provide solutions that help them at every step of the way.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything, Joel, that we might have missed in this podcast when it comes to SaaS? Anything that I have not asked you, which I should have asked? Anything that comes to mind?
Nothing particular. As I said, I think the reality is that SaaS looks different for everybody, and actually different for industry. So if I look at what SaaS looks like for CAD, it is going to look different to what SaaS looks like for simulation. CAD doesn't necessarily have those needs for high performance computing. And so I think that's one thing to always keep in mind, is there's no one size fits all for SaaS. Ultimately, it's about what you're doing and what you want to do, and then choosing that. And so that's part of a lot of what we do as well. You know, I work in product management for SaaS, and so a lot of what we do is looking at, okay, well, what does SaaS look like for simulation? How is that different to, say, the PLM world and the CAD world, and crafting solutions that fit that. As I said, there's no one size fits all, and as I said, every customer's on a different journey. So I don't think, I think that's, I guess, my thing I've learned. I mean, ultimately, I came from the CFD world. I used to run the Simcenter SaaS Product Management team up until about 4 years ago. So I knew a little bit about SaaS. So I had a lot of learning to do when I took on a new role, and it's been a fun journey, but learning about what it means for the simulation world, what SaaS and cloud means for the simulation world, has been one of the biggest things. And again, it's moving so fast that it's a lot for us to keep up with, and it's a lot for our customers to keep up with. But you know, it's an exciting time, and it certainly keeps me busy.
Yeah. How do you stay yourself up to date with the latest changes? Because everything moves so quickly, as you just said, right? Like, what do you do personally to upskill yourself when it comes to all the changes in HPC architecture, etc.?
Well, so one of the nice things is with Altair coming on board, they've got a whole team that deal with HPC. It's their job with the HPC work. So I've now got this great resource who live and breathe HPC all day long. I mean, the other thing we do a lot of is we work extremely closely with hyperscalers, and especially AWS. We work very closely with them to understand what they're doing with their solutions, what their new solutions are bringing to market, so we can leverage them and we can benefit from them, and we can pass that benefit on to our customers. The other great thing we do here at Siemens Digital Industry Software is every quarter we have a learning day. So essentially that's a day where we are blocked out in our calendars, everything's cancelled, and we are encouraged to learn. Like, we have a day where we can do whatever training we want to. We provide lots of in-house training. We can go to, Coursera or something like that. We can sit down and read a book about it. So I think that's one of the great things we do as a company for everybody who works here, is that we can really encourage to upskill. And it's one of the great things actually about working with Siemens, to be perfectly honest, is that encouragement to learn and that encouragement to grow. And you'll probably see a lot in the press about how Siemens is reinventing itself as this one tech company. So again, all of Siemens is in this transformation, which means we need to learn. And it's great that I get to work for a company that really encourages that, that's willing to say, block out a day in your calendar every quarter and learn. And there's lots of opportunities for learning as well. And I've got a book just next to me on my desk here called Co-Intelligence, which is talking about living and working with AI. So that's the other thing, that as we move to SaaS, obviously AI is becoming so much an important thing we do. So I'm going to sit down and read that later and try and help myself understand how I can use AI better, other than just asking it stupid questions about what's going on in the world.
Yeah, definitely. You have to send me the link of that book later so I can also read it. Sounds super interesting. How can people find out more about your HPC and SaaS solutions? Any websites you would recommend? I mean, obviously the Siemens website, but any specific links, blog? I mean, I can also share some blogs from you, Joel, if you want to.
Yeah, so there's definitely a few blogs around. If you go to the Siemens website, you'll see those blogs, the Simcenter blogs, which talk about our different HPC solutions, talk about Simcenter X Advanced, which we just released. Of course, LinkedIn's another good area to look at. There's a video of me talking about Simcenter X Advanced. which we released recently, which personally I find excruciating watching myself on videos, but I hope people find it instructive and interesting. Yeah, and as I said, the blogs are the best one, and there's just so much information out there these days. I think go to the Siemens website. That's a great place to start. That'll tell you about what we have today. And as I said, the blogs are a great way of also understanding some of the specifics and the intricacies of what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Joel, thank you very much for this insightful podcast. Hopefully there will be a second part in a couple of years when the HPC world changed a little bit again. But yeah, I will share every resource that you mentioned down in the description. People can reach out to you also via LinkedIn if they want to. And again, thank you very much for this very insightful podcast.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.